Good evening, everyone. My name is Ann Scott, and I'm lucky and honored to be the head librarian at the Nantucket Atheneum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening back in person for the second lecture of this year's season. I'd like to first introduce River Bennett, Nantucket's own, who will then be moderating tonight's discussion. But first, I'd like to give thanks to the Geschke family, without whom a series like this would not be possible. And as great librarians, we love to bring together people to engage in important conversations and interact with great thought leadership. So we're delighted to welcome you back for another opportunity to do just that. River Bennett is a Nantucket native who was born and raised on island. He was named a Nantucket Scholar in 2009 and studied energy policy at the University of Virginia, where he graduated with a BA in political and social thought, after writing his undergraduate thesis on the political rhetoric associated with the concept of energy independence. Today, River is a graduate research assistant at the University of Michigan and is pursuing an MS in nuclear engineering. He's supported by the National Reactor Innovation Center and Fastest Path to Zero, and researches siting, community engagement, and environmental justice considerations for advanced reactors. He's also a fellow at the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, as well as a lead organizer and past participant of the Nuclear Innovation Boot Camp. Prior to these roles, he worked in both EdTech and international development with a focus on water and sanitation access. Please help me welcome River Bennett.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight. I want to thank Janet Forrest and the Nantucket Atheneum for not only working with us to organize this event, but for making this presentation a part of the Geschke lecture series. I would also like to thank the Great Harbor Yacht Club for hosting us in their beautiful space. I'm also joined on stage, or soon to be on stage, by some colleagues who I want to thank for being here and who I'm going to introduce shortly. My name is River Bennett, and I was born and raised on Nantucket. Today, I work as a researcher at the National Reactor Innovation Center, also known as NRIC, and as a graduate nuclear engineering student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where I'll be continuing on my PhD this fall. For those who don't know me, you probably know my mom. She works or manages Nantucket Bookworks, or maybe my dad, who's a carpenter and served previously as the chair of the Conservation Commission. Growing up here is a gift, because this community values nothing more than the support of its children. I would not be here or where I am today without the help I've received from a list of individuals and organizations that is too long to share here. But I will name one organization. In 2009, I was awarded the Nantucket Golf Club Scholarship, which not only paid for college, but also provided the freedom to explore and uncover a passion that I'm looking forward to sharing with you all this evening. Nuclear energy has received a steadily growing amount of attention over the last several years, for reasons that we continue to read about in the daily headlines: energy prices, climate change, national security. Despite the attention, the details of this technology and the industry that supports it can seem very esoteric. This is a challenge for our sector and something that we are working on addressing through events like this. However, one observation that I'd like to make is that being esoteric isn't all that bad. My brother recently sent me this picture from a party that he was at. He's a pretty cool guy. He went to art school at the Cooper Union in New York City, and I think it clearly demonstrates that nuclear energy is becoming just topical enough for the cool kids to start wearing our t-shirts out in public. This theory is further supported by the fact that we also now have activist supermodel TikTok nuclear energy influencers, meaning that the message is traveling beyond the op-ed pages of the major newspapers. On a more serious note, I want to share one of my favorite graphs to show you what the nuclear energy sector looks like today. The US is currently graduating the highest number of nuclear engineers in 40 years, And many of these people are going on to work in advanced reactor startup companies founded during the last decade. For me, the most important thing this graph demonstrates is the dedication and enthusiasm of the young people committing themselves to this sector. To be clear, it takes more than just nuclear engineers to get a nuclear power plant built. But in the same way that the oil industry tallies the number of active drilling rigs to predict future oil output, I think we can confidently say that there is a lot of activity ahead for the nuclear energy sector. Today, there are over 50 companies in North America developing advanced fission reactors, fusion reactors, and the supply chains that will enable these technologies. Much of the progress to date has paired fundamental research and experiments from last century with advanced materials, construction methods, simulations, and modeling from this century. These innovations are being designed on a bedrock of experience with nuclear energy technologies. The United States fleet of commercial nuclear power plants has alone accumulated over 4,500 reactor years of operating experience since its first plant opened in 1957. This number does not include multiple decades of experience from research, experimental, and prototype reactors operating across campuses at US universities and national laboratories. Importantly, we're also identifying better ways to, this time around, to partner with the communities where we work to prevent the types of injustices perpetrated during the dawn of the atomic age. This includes working with governments at the local, state, and federal level to identify a solution for our nation's nuclear waste and spent nuclear fuel. Each of these topics will be covered in detail by our panelists, and the way that this is going to work is that I'll introduce each one. They'll come up and present for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then for the last 20 to 30 minutes, we'll open the floor for audience Q&A. So the first presenter that I'd like to introduce is Dr. Jenifer Shafer. Dr. Shafer is a full professor in the chemistry department and nuclear science and engineering program at the Colorado School of Mines and directs the fundamental and applied F-element research group. She came to Mines following a staff scientist appointment at Pacific Northwest National Lab. She received her PhD from Washington State University and BS from Colorado State University. Jenifer is interested in developing metal recycling and separations technologies to support nuclear and renewable energy, as well as national security. Current areas of particular interest include the use of new materials and controlling various chemical phenomena. She's the co-author of over 70 manuscripts and book chapters and has led or collaborated on projects receiving over $35 million, with around $5 million directly supporting her research group. Jenifer has a significant and deep knowledge of nuclear waste management and recycling possibilities and is considered a national leader in this area. So please join me in welcoming Jenifer up to the stage.
There we go. Thank you very much for that, River. And as they know, I have a tendency to walk around a little bit when I'm talking, so can take the professor out of the university, but not the, however that quote goes. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your, I believe this is Tuesday, your Tuesday afternoon to come and learn a little bit more about things nuclear. I know how precious my Tuesday evenings are to me, and so I just really appreciate your interest in general in the area. And so what I wanted to do with the time here today that I've been allotted is talk to you a little bit about what nuclear waste is, what's basically been produced from our current operating reactor fleet, what's going to come about from potentially our future reactor fleet, of which Ashley and other people are managing and developing here. And then also talk about what some of the possibilities are with respect to its management versus what some of the plans are. And I'm excited for any questions that you guys have in this regard. So basically, nuclear fuel, as we know it, is put into a reactor, fissions, produces electricity, and then eventually, of course, we need to pull it out of the reactor. It turns out that when we pull it out of the reactor, we've only consumed about 5% of the energy use of that material. So this would, and then we take it out. And so this would be equivalent if, I don't know if any of you have cars with 20-gallon gas tanks, but basically taking 1 gallon of gas and throwing away the other 19 gallons of that tank. So it turns out that there's lots of different ways that we can manage it and think about it, and that's a focus of my research group, and we'll get into that just a little bit now. But so right now what's actually happening with the fuel is basically it's sitting on site, at where we currently have nuclear reactors. And so it depends on how fresh the fuel is, if we want to call it that, basically how recently it was pulled from the reactor. So if it was very recently pulled from the reactor, then it sits in spent fuel pools, basically. So these are water-cooled pools that help maintain the cooling of the fuel as well as actually provide radioactive shielding of this. And then if it's sat around for a while, it's actually placed in something called dry cask storage. And so this material is actually basically sealed in concrete on some level. It's not like poured concrete over it, but it's in a concrete cask and it's managed. And the NRC has spent a lot of time looking basically at the safety and efficacy and management and treatment of these things, and these things are all basically actively looked at. And so how many people in the room have heard about Yucca Mountain? So just a couple, right? And nominally, right, does anybody care what to say nominally Yucca Mountain was supposed to be for? Storage. Yeah, it was the national repository for our nuclear waste. So basically, in the 70s, we went through and evaluated a variety of different options for how we would actually dispose of our nuclear waste. We considered a couple of different ones, including the possibility of actually launching it out into space. That was taken off the table because of cost factors at the time, but also in general, you can imagine that there would be the safety basis for reactors and what could happen basically in launching nuclear fuel if there was an accident. This would not be good at all. So we've said let's take that off the table. So the plan has basically been to put it in some form of a geological repository. Nominally for about 10,000 years is when this repository is supposed to function and maintain the waste for. Basically the material stays radioactive for a very long period of time. And so we want to make sure that the engineered barrier will retain and manage that. And we'll talk about a little bit more about how we can maybe change that. So we know that Yucca Mountain was functionally, the funding's been pulled for Yucca Mountain. There are a lot of reasons why you can kind of look into this, some political, some technical, depending on who you talk to, but basically we know that that's probably not where we're going to put our nuclear waste at this time. So right now, the Department of Energy is actually going through and it's actually reevaluating what's called a consent-based siting process for where we could put our fuel. And so that's kind of nominally how our nuclear waste sets up at this time. I'll do a time check. How am I doing, River? He'll get back to me on that. That's okay. So one thing though that I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about is the fact that, get back to that 5% factor and the fact that we only take basically 1 gallon of fuel and then throw the other 19 away. It turns out that the reason why this happens is because over the course of the fission process, actually contaminants grow in. And they actually basically kind of mess with the fission process. So they basically make it run not so efficiently. And so what you could do is, so these are other elements that grow in. So you could actually chop it up, dissolve it, and purify it, and put it back into the reactor. And it turns out that the contaminants that grow in actually have a lot of value to them. Some of them are actually noble transition metals, so things like palladium or platinum that are actually worth, and actually in our current used nuclear fuel, we have about $60 billion worth of noble transition metals that we could use and deploy. And so that's actually one thing that's there. But then there's other things like medical radioisotopes and technetium-99 and molybdenum. These are used frequently in millions of life savings procedures over the course of the year, and that's also in there. And so you could recover some of these contaminants that are currently causing problems, set them aside for commercial value, and then you could actually put the fuel back into the reactor and generate more energy from it. And so in that regard, you'd at least put a pause on not generating any more nuclear waste on some level. And it depends on what reactor you deploy and kind of all these sorts of things, but so it minimizes the waste volume that you produce. The other thing that you could potentially have at your disposal is the idea of could you put it in a reactor that actually makes the lifetime of the waste much shorter. So could you take it from a 1,000,000-year problem, which is nominally what it is right now. We said legally 10,000 years, but it's really much more like a 1,000,000-year problem. What's a couple of zeros among friends? So could you actually turn this into, we got four minutes. Okay, perfect. So could you actually turn this into a several 100-year problem? And so several 100 years is still a really long time. At least we're not talking about intercivilizational challenges, we're talking about intergenerational, but this is actually much more akin to what we actually currently have when we compare among other energy resources. We know that CO2 in the atmosphere will stick around for several hundred years. We know that, just in general mining waste, et cetera, these things will stick around for a period that's somewhat akin to that. And so that kind of level sets there. But the other thing is that we know that we actually have documents that have been around for several hundred years, and we can kind of learn from that and go from there. So this process is called reprocessing, or recycling is how I think about it. And actually, France does this. They've done this for many years, and this is something that we could actually be doing here. And that's actually what we do as a part of my research group, is we actually look at ways that we could be doing this much more effectively. We could look at ways that we can do it more cheaply. Right now, a reprocessing facility costs something on the order of tens of billions of dollars. We'd like to actually cut that by much less than that to make it much more cost competitive. But then also we want to make sure that we're doing this securely and maintaining all the material where it needs to be. People are always very attentive to plutonium. This would be produced potentially over the course of a recycling and making sure that you're accounting for it and not allowing it to be diverted. And so nominally, these are basically some of the options that we have when it comes to managing our nuclear waste, or a lot of times how I think about it as nuclear fuel. So basically, we know that it's stored on site in our nuclear reactors and in some form of either in our pools or in dry cask storage. We know that we're actively evaluating options such that we could site geological disposal of the material at some point, but then we also know that we could significantly limit the amount of material that we make in general, but that we could also recycle it. And the other thing I'll maybe just point out is that we know that in considering the current geopolitical climate, we're also very attentive to supply chains and critical minerals and resources. And this is going to be something that we need to be very attentive to in general across the clean energy transition. One of the things that actually has value when it comes to the use of nuclear fuel is that it's already mined and it's already here in the US. And so it's actually something that we can use. And so in that ways, it gives us a little bit of an energy independence there. So I'm very excited for questions that you might have, happy to talk more, but I'll go ahead and cede the floor to the other panelists that we have here. So.
Great. Thank you, Jenifer. So the next up is Dr. William Rob Stewart. Dr. Stewart is co-founder and CEO of Boston Atomics, a Massachusetts-based energy startup that aims to provide low-carbon process heat to industrial customers using nuclear power. Boston Atomics is solving the nuclear cost problem with a focus on design for constructability. Stewart recently earned his PhD from MIT in nuclear science and engineering. His thesis analyzed the cost and risk, advantages and disadvantages of advanced nuclear technology. Prior to MIT, he was a project leader at GE Global Research. He has an MS and BS in mechanical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin.
Great, thanks. Yeah, very excited to be here. Robbie Stewart, CEO and co-founder of Boston Atomics, and we're aiming to provide reliable, dispatchable, low-carbon heat to industrial process heat customers. And I'll get into what I mean by that in a second. But this is my first time on the island, and to get to come here and also talk about nuclear power is quite the treat. So thank you very much for the opportunity and giving me the space to be here. Very excited about it. But when I come to a new place, I like to look up a couple of things about the place, right? And being a sort of a climate-focused person, one of the things I look up is sea level rise. So this is a map of your island, as you're very familiar, with the sea levels as of 2022. And we can zoom in a bit, and I've got a little pin for where we are at the Yacht Club. And by 2070, so that's 48 years into the future, Lord willing, within my lifetime, we'll see. There's the upper bound sea level rise for Massachusetts could be about 4 feet. So we can add 4 feet of sea level rise and we can see what happens to the town of Nantucket. And we lose a lot of the waterfront, right? Like the water's coming in, a lot of the shops and things are there. The Great Harbor Yacht Club might become the Tiny Island Yacht Club. If you notice, we're sort of on an island in this chart. So we could still be here, but in a different form. But I share all this just to say this is the motivation for nuclear, I think, in 2022, is that we have to decarbonize our entire economy. And that's not a small endeavor, it's not a small undertaking. And I think nuclear plays a big role in accomplishing that challenge, that feat. So the second thing I like to do when I'm coming to a new place is look at the electricity mix of that town. And thankfully, you're in the New England ISO, which is where I am in Boston. So this is very easy. You have the same energy mix that I do. So at 10 a.m. this morning, when I put these slides together, this is a pie chart of the electricity mix for what was coming through your power sockets and powering your light bulbs. And you can see it was, what were we looking at? 63% natural gas, 24% nuclear, and 10% renewables and 2% hydro. So that's not bad. We're looking at like 36% low carbon, which is I think a pretty good goal. You know, we're 1/3 of the way there to getting to 100% zero carbon power. That's I think an important step. But we still have a long way to go, right? Getting from 36% to 100% is still a lot. The other thing I'll say is that this is 24% of our electricity coming from nuclear power, and that's only at 2 plants, and it's 3 reactors. So there's 2 in Connecticut and 1 in New Hampshire. So 3 individual reactors are providing 24% of all of New England. That's Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont. All of the electricity there is provided by 3 reactors. So these are really remarkable plants when we think about them. And this isn't just the power of 1975, this is also the power of 2022, right? This is where our electricity is today. The other thing that's interesting is you can zoom in and look at what's classified as renewables here. And this is always interesting to me. It was a sunny and windy morning. So wind here was 34% of our power, solar was 24%, and being Massachusetts, the other like 40% was burning trash and burning wood, because those are renewable sources of power in Massachusetts. If we look at the energy future, what we need to be scaling is this wind, solar, nuclear, hydro. There's these zero carbon options we have, and we need to be deploying them very rapidly if we're going to decarbonize. And that's not just me saying that. You can look at quotes from the IPCC. This is the International Panel on Climate Change. And they forecast a 50 to 500% growth in global nuclear power if we're to meet our climate objectives. And similarly, the UN Economic Council for Europe has a similar goal of saying that we just will not meet our climate objectives if nuclear power is excluded. So I think there's a lot of momentum behind nuclear, and this is some of why that is. But like I said, Boston Atomics were focused specifically on industrial process heat. So this is like petrochemical plants producing plastics and chemicals and fertilizer. This is oil refining, textiles, desalination, cement production, pharmaceuticals, pulp and paper, food. There's a lot of heat that's used in our economy that is produced by coal, natural gas, and oil today. And this is about 10 to 20% of global carbon emissions is just heat for these industrial processes. And our aim is to use nuclear power to provide that heat without producing carbon emissions. But there's clearly a challenge, right? Anytime you see something that looks that nice, there's a reason why it's not happening. And we think that it's important for the nuclear industry to be honest about how things are going right now. And if you look globally, there's a not great report card for nuclear in the last 20 years. If you look at France, the US, the UK, Finland, places in East Asia even, the typical nuclear project today is 2 to 3x its original budget and 2 to 3x over its construction schedule. So if nuclear is going to play a role in the future of energy, it's got to overcome these challenges, and we can only overcome them if we're honest about them, and that's why I bring them up here. So Boston Atomics, our focus here is on constructability. We think that the key to solving the cost and construction delay problem is thinking about design from how do we make it easy to build all of the buildings. So you came here for a talk on nuclear. I'm going to give you a quick lecture on construction engineering. Apologize for that, but this is really basic, and I think it's very intuitive. My 6-month-old daughter can get it, so I think we can all get on the same page here. The building span, which is how far apart are your walls. That's the lower axis here. The building height, that's how tall the building is. If you just look at a plot of those 2 things, the further down you go in this direction, the easier it is to build. I can build something out of popsicle sticks that's this big. I can build something out of wood that's the size of this room. I'm going to build a skyscraper out of steel and concrete. So as you get bigger, things just get more complicated, right? This is, my 6-month-old daughter knows that it's hard to knock over the block when it's on its side. It's really easy to knock it over when it's vertical, right? This is very basic. So our thesis as a startup, as one of the many nuclear startups, is that we need to design our reactors to be as easy to build as possible. And so this British architect engineer sort of made this plot, put these rooms on here. You got a bedroom, living room, toilet block, because they're British, theater, sports arena, warehouse. And you can see that they're all kind of squeezed down at the bottom left. Now, if we look at where traditional large nuclear reactors fit, I've got to squeeze down that plot that you saw before on the left, and large reactors are way up here. So they're way beyond what the construction industry is good at and is doing regularly. When they're building apartments and homes and skyscrapers, this is way beyond what they're used to. And that's why these projects are so challenging. Now, a lot of small modular reactors is, like I think River mentioned, there's 50 other startups working on this problem right now, and we're all sort of working to get down the curve, right? A lot of other small modular reactors, they've sort of incrementally moved us from where the large reactor problem is. But at Boston Atomics, our focus is to be way down here, way within the realm of what is easy to construct. So I think I'm probably near the end of my time. So we are supported by the Department of Energy by a program who I think Dr. Finan was one of the architects of, and so we owe her a great deal of gratitude. You'll hear from her in a minute. We have partners with great institutions, MIT, Buffalo, Michigan, Argonne National Lab, and NPR Associates. And I just finished my PhD at MIT, and so we're in the process of hiring folks, raising capital, building momentum today. I will leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions here in a couple minutes.
So for our final presentation, I am very excited to present my boss and mentor, Dr. Ashley Finan. Dr. Finan's family has been coming to Nantucket for 30 years. And I want to tell a little story about how we met, because at the end of 2016, I was figuring out what I wanted to do still. And I was working as a STEM tutor and a dishwasher in Spain when I made the decision to dive headfirst into the nuclear energy sector. I decided to do that by starting a post-baccalaureate program that would prepare me for graduate nuclear engineering studies. 2 years into this adventure, I realized it was probably time to pursue a slightly more topical job. And through some networking, I was introduced to Ashley and landed a phone interview that I will never forget for 2 reasons. The first reason was that it became immediately clear during our conversation that we were both drawn to this work because of the positive impacts it could have on people on the planet. I realized that I had found a community of like-minded people where I could dedicate my career. The second reason is that I am fairly certain there was only one interview question. After introductions, she simply asked, "Well, River, what can you do?" I must have answered that question correctly, because 3.5 years later, I still get to work for her. So Dr. Ashley Finan is the director of the National Reactor Innovation Center, a U.S. Department of Energy program funded at the end of 2019 and tasked with accelerating the demonstration and deployment of advanced nuclear energy. In this role, she is responsible for overseeing initiatives to provide resources to reactor innovators to test, demonstrate, and conduct performance assessments to accelerate the deployment of advanced nuclear technology concepts. Dr. Finan most recently served as executive director for the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, where she was responsible for managing the organization's strategy, operations, policy and technical development, stakeholder outreach, academic teams, industry stakeholders, and NGOs. Dr. Finan previously served as the director of nuclear innovation at the Clean Air Task Force. Dr. Finan earned her PhD, SM, and SB in nuclear science and engineering, as well as an SB in physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please join me in welcoming her up to the stage.
Thanks so much, River, and thanks very much for having me here today. And also, I want to thank folks for taking your Tuesday evening to talk about nuclear energy. I'll try to be quick because I want to get to your questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them. It's an honor to be here with Jenifer, with Robbie, and especially with River, who is changing the world and is doing that from his base here in Nantucket, and I think that's a really important and really special thing. So as River mentioned, I am director of the National Reactor Innovation Center, or NRIC for short. It's a DOE, Department of Energy program, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that here. First, I know you've learned a bit about advanced nuclear energy from our previous speakers, but I'm just going to give an overview of the technology. In general, our current plants are very big. They're light water reactors. They're cooled with water. They're around 1 gigawatt in size. Advanced reactors are generally categorized in terms of how large they are. So you hear about microreactors, small reactors, medium reactors, and large reactors. And as you've heard earlier, there are dozens and dozens of private sector projects right now working to commercialize these advanced technologies because of the imperative of climate change, of energy security and energy independence, and other geopolitical issues that many companies are seeing today and reacting to. And they use a variety of different coolants. So you might hear about gas-cooled reactors, or sodium or salt or lead-cooled reactors or water-cooled reactors. It's all, those are the different things that are used to cool the reactor to make electricity. It's not particularly important what those coolants are. The purpose of using those different coolants is to achieve higher performance. So to achieve improved safety characteristics, improved waste characteristics, higher security, and better economics. And right now we have reactors that are cooled by water. Well, we got there because we had a nuclear submarine program, and water-cooled reactors make a lot of sense on a submarine. They turn out to be what we use on land because we followed the submarine program. It doesn't turn out that they're always best on land. These other coolants can allow us to achieve higher efficiencies that are less expensive, higher temperatures that allow us to look at those process heat markets that Robbie was describing, and would allow us to do the decarbonization that these companies are seeking to do. So, so fundamentally improving their performance. Also looking at diverse markets. So these reactors are looking at markets from marine shipping to industrial process heat, data centers, and large central station generation. So you heard from Jenifer to begin with about nuclear waste and how we can do better there, and then from Robbie about one of the startup companies in the space. And I think one of the things that I want you to come away from my talk with is that we can do this, that in fact it is possible. Because a lot of folks are really pessimistic about whether we can demonstrate advanced nuclear energy, commercialize it, and build it on budget and on schedule as Robbie's seeking to do. And we've actually done this before as a nation. Out at Idaho National Laboratory, where I work now, we demonstrated 52 reactors over a period of 25 years. We saw a reactor in Tennessee designed, built, and started up in under a year. So this can be done quickly. We have done it before. And we're doing it again. So you heard from Robbie about the program that he's part of, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program through the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy has made a commitment to advanced reactor demonstrations with a program that's funding more than $10 billion of demonstrations. My program is here to help support these companies, but that Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program represents an enormous investment of our policymakers in this technology, and that's gonna help us be successful. And we're doing it better this time. We're really working to ensure that the technologies we're demonstrating will meet the needs of society moving forward and will meet the needs of markets. So part of our vision at the National Reactor Innovation Center is to demonstrate at least 2 advanced reactors by the end of 2025. By doing that, to help reestablish US nuclear energy leadership. This technology was born here in the US, and we used to be leaders in this technology. Today, 46% of nuclear technology contracts globally are Russian contracts. So this is now an industry that's largely led by Russia and China. But we have the opportunity with these amazing companies to take the lead again. If we can just move from this conceptual design phase to demonstration and commercialization. And that's what the Department of Energy is working with the private sector to do now. NRIC is working to achieve our mission, or our vision of 2 by the end of 2025 through our mission to inspire stakeholders and the public, to empower innovators to test and demonstrate their technologies by enabling access to all of our national laboratories, the expertise, the facilities, and the materials at the national labs, and to deliver successful outcomes through efficient coordination of partners and resources across the country. And we believe that as we empower the private sector, with government resources and access to the national laboratories, we'll be able to deliver those successful demonstration projects, and that will inspire folks who hope that nuclear will be there to decarbonize and to meet our energy needs, but who need to see it and who need to see it proven. So these colors didn't come out quite right, but that's okay. This is a timeline that shows between now and 2030 some of the key demonstration projects that we're working on at Idaho National Laboratory and elsewhere across the country. And the point of this slide is that we have a dozen or so projects that are planning to demonstrate between 2023 and 2029. So we have a lot of shots on goal. Probably not every single one will be successful, but really what we need are just one or two to be successful to drive change and to drive advanced nuclear into the market. So at NRIC, as we look to that goal of 2 by the end of 2025, we have 3 years, 5 months, and 19 days. And I think I'm the only one counting, but it's my job. So the way that we're working to achieve that isn't nuclear science or rocket science, it's basic logistics. We're working to build a facility for demonstration while innovators are building their reactors. So one example of that is a test bed we're building in Idaho. It's actually repurposing a dome that already sits there from one of those reactors that was built many years ago. It's now an empty dome, and NRIC, my program, is working to modify it, to put new doors on it, to put some safety systems in, and to prepare it so that innovators can come in and have this containment, this defense in depth, the safety system to demonstrate their reactors for the first time. And we're working to complete that to meet that 2025 timeline. Some of the companies we're working with are these listed here. I won't go through them. It's just to show you that we're working with a lot of companies. There are a lot of companies moving forward in this space. And not all of them are looking for a test bed facility, but some of them are. But we have other parts of our program that address others. So we have experimental facilities that we're preparing and putting together. And I won't go into detail on those. And then a key element of what we're doing differently today is making sure we're addressing cost and markets. So one exciting part of that, from my perspective, is advanced construction technology. There are a lot of construction technologies, and Robbie gave you a lesson in construction. It's really the key. About a decade of cost analysis has shown that it's the concrete and steel that are driving costs, not the nuclear core, not the water or the lead or the sodium. It's the concrete and steel. So there are technologies that are used in other industries regularly that could dramatically reduce costs for nuclear. And we're working in a cost-shared partnership with GE Hitachi and a number of other companies to demonstrate an excavation technology and then a steel brick technology that's like Legos for containment and Legos for a structure. And as we demonstrate those, we'll make those available for nuclear projects to use to reduce costs and to improve their construction outcomes. Then we have digital engineering that's been shown to dramatically reduce costs in all sorts of construction industries, but it's not used in nuclear in the US. So we're working to make that available to nuclear companies and help them use it. And then integrated energy systems. As we look to the future, we envision a grid that has a balance among nuclear and renewables, and you can trade them off, and you can have more nuclear when the sun is dark or the wind isn't blowing, and you can go up and down in order to balance against renewables. You can switch from electricity to process heat in order to really achieve the decarbonized grid. So we're working on demonstrating that technology. And then we're doing proactive impact management, so specifically looking at environmental impacts of advanced reactors and ensuring that we know how to handle those impacts and to mitigate those impacts. And then finally, engagement. So we've recognized that advanced nuclear needs to do things differently from conventional nuclear. The nuclear industry is really probably infamous for doing terrible public engagement and not really taking public feedback well. Advanced nuclear needs to do that differently. We need to innovate in our socio-technical systems just the same way we innovate in our technology. And a lot of that work is really what River is focused on in his doctoral work, along with a team of social scientists. So we're working with University of Michigan and Fastest Path to Zero to develop those best practices under River's leadership. And we have a number of other university efforts that are looking to identify how we can ensure that environmental justice is incorporated into advanced nuclear deployment in the future. So just to close, our goals for this year at NRIC are to maintain progress to support demonstrations by the end of 2025 and sustain innovation thereafter by preparing vital infrastructure like test beds and experimental infrastructure, by providing planning tools and resources, by demonstrating cost-cutting technologies like advanced construction technologies and integrated energy systems, by anticipating and addressing regulatory needs, building and developing our team, and strengthening and expanding our partnerships and engagement. And with that, I will thank you again for your time and attention, and we can move on to questions.
So can Germany use the remaining nuclear power plants it has instead of decommissioning them as scheduled?
We'd have to look into the status of the nuclear power plants in Germany in concept. If they haven't been decommissioned already, then they could still be used. But once they start to decommission them, it's very hard to bring them back.
Yeah, it was my understanding, I think, that, right, it's basically some of them maybe are too far gone, but there's kind of, maybe a couple that it's still basically what Ashley said, it's actively being evaluated.
Okay. This next one's a good one because I like microreactors, like the defense reactor currently being built in Idaho, known as Project Pele. Are an interesting technology applicable to small areas with unique energy needs. How do you see microreactors fitting in within the US and internationally to meet climate goals, address growing energy needs, and grow young scientists and engineers?
There are a lot of uses for microreactors. So they are not a bulk power source. They're a replacement for a diesel generator or a small gas turbine. But anywhere there's a diesel generator, you could replace it with a microreactor. So that means an enormous portion of Africa uses diesel generators for their electricity. It's very dirty, it's very expensive, it's not good for energy access, but everywhere there's a diesel generator, there could be a microreactor. That's true in remote villages in Alaska, in Canada. It's true in islands. It's true here on Nantucket. You have a couple of cables to the mainland and a couple of diesel generators and a battery. But everywhere there's a diesel generator, you could have a microreactor. You could also power data centers that want to have clean energy with microreactors that are more reliable than the grid. And then there is the potential for electric vehicle stations. So right now we have a lot of gas stations. If we want to go to electric vehicles, we need to have filling stations where you can quickly charge your car. And when you go to quickly charge your car, you put an enormous strain on the grid. So you need to have a lot of power right there. You can't just say, I need zero energy and now I need 20 megawatts 5 seconds later for 2 minutes, and now I go down to zero. The grid doesn't like that. But a battery with a microreactor could do that through clean energy. And then one more, there are just so many great uses for this. There are points of congestion in our grid, many in New England, where there isn't enough generation and there isn't enough transmission to meet the local need. So we need to have a local way to produce energy or to store energy. And so you could put a big battery there, and batteries are fine, they do good work, but they're not making energy, they're just using it and they're losing some of it. Alternatively, you could put a microreactor there. And instead of needing to waste energy in a battery, you could be making energy in that point of congestion for transmission. And while it's really hard to build nuclear power plants and to site them, it's incredibly hard to site transmission. So I think there are a lot of great uses for microreactors, and I'll ask Robbie and Jenifer if they want to add anything.
Yeah, I think Ashley gave a great overview of all the benefits of microreactors. I might just touch on a couple of different things that she didn't get to. One of them is actually, interestingly, the maritime sector. Of course, you do have diesel generators there, but right, space, I don't know if, well, actually, I feel like it's kind of funny me asking people on Nantucket if they've ever been to a port, but so if you've ever been to a port, you know that you're incredibly space constrained, right? And so the ability to generate power in a very dense way has a really high premium, and decarbonization of the maritime sector is going to be a challenge that we have to address. So that's one important sector. Another thing just globally is we look at what our grid is versus what it potentially needs to be tomorrow. We know that based on what we're starting to see already from climate change and what we see moving forward, that resiliency might look a little bit different than what we've kind of experienced. And there's actually going to be an impetus probably to provide resiliency that we haven't had before, in the regard that we frankly just probably need more and need more robust and diverse energy sectors to kind of touch on that. And so that's another place where even if you maybe have some of these different capacities put in, batteries, et cetera, that there still would probably be benefit to actually having a micro reactor there. So I don't know if, Robbie, you had anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I can just add one real quick one. It's a concept that's foreign to us in America, but very common in Eastern and Northern Europe, which is district heating. So if you imagine you pay for your heat by buying gas or oil or whatever it is, there's places in Eastern Europe that actually have hot water piped into their home, and that hot water is used to heat their home, make the hot water for their faucets. And typically that heat for that is generated very near to the city center. So you need something small, power dense, that can be close to the city, and microreactors have a potential there.
Great. I'm going to ask kind of a joint question here. Because a few of the questions here are, how do we allay fears of nuclear technology? And also, what is it about advanced reactors that make them safer?
I'll maybe go ahead and take a stab at the how to allay fears about nuclear, and I say that I think if any one of us had the answer here, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But other than to say this is an important question, I don't know that we have a great answer. A big reason why I think Ashley and Robbie and River and all of us are here is just to provide a point of contact for everybody to just talk through nuclear and understand the technology. I do think that nuclear historically has not done itself favors with respect to the level of access to the technology, the accessibility of it, and I mean even this touches on historically what the defense programs have been, right? And frequently the defense programs and the commercial programs can get conflated, but when they were building B reactor out at Hanford. So this was in South Central Washington State. And they were, this was basically the reactor that was going to make the plutonium for Fat Man. So the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. So at any rate, when they brought people out there to work on it, they didn't actually tell them what they were doing. They said, come out here and we'll give you a stake in a house and you'll make the reactor, right? And so, I mean, we've done ourselves not a lot of favors as an industry, and that, obviously this was a different time and there were different intersections with that. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do as a community is there are technical experts that exist. The technical experts can make themselves available for conversation, and then also, most importantly, listen. I think sometimes there's been this thought that, well, gosh, if we just explained it better, right? It's just people don't understand because we haven't explained it. It's sometimes we don't listen very well, and we don't really understand what people's concerns are, and are we actually speaking to those concerns, or are we speaking to what we think are the challenges? So those are globally things here, and I'm so grateful that River and Ashley and folks are taking point on some of this, but I'll let certainly others comment.
Yeah, I could take a shot at maybe the second question, which is what makes advanced reactors safer. And I think there's a number of things. I'll just think about two things for nuclear plants. The first is stored energy. So where is there energy that is pent up that if it's not controlled, something bad happens? And in a light water cooled reactor, which is what we have today, that's high temperature, high pressure water. And if there's a break, that water flashes into steam. So it's a lot of stored energy that then has to be contained. So a lot of the cost actually in plants is these large concrete structures to contain that accident if it were to occur. But that stored energy is because water changes phase. It goes from water to steam, and that's a huge volume expansion. Now, part of the benefit of those different coolants that Ashley mentioned, sodium, salt, helium in our case, is that they don't phase change. Helium already is a gas. sodium and salts have such high boiling temperatures that they won't flash. So the stored energy is completely different for these advanced reactors. And the second thing I should think about is what's called defense in depth. So the way that we talk about safety in reactors today is how many barriers between the nuclear fuel where the radioactivity is and the workers in the plant or the community nearby. And so we want to have as many layers of defense, a lot of defense in depth. And advanced nuclear, in our case, and in the case of several other advanced nuclear startups, are planning to use a fuel that's called TRISO. And instead of being just a uranium pellet, it is a uranium pellet that has 3 protective layers embedded in very small particles of it. And this makes it very difficult for that radioactivity to escape in any way. In fact, it's nearly impossible except under very, very high temperatures. And so this different fuel form provides a lot more safety than what is seen in today's light water reactors. And I don't want to make any of that sound like that what is out there today is unsafe. It just makes this sort of a new generation of safety for advanced reactors.
And I'll just add, I think that was very well said. I will add that today's reactors, on their very worst day, we've seen that. That's Fukushima, very worst day. And there was contamination outside the site, and there was evacuation, and there's land that's now uninhabited. And I've been there, and it's quite sad. Most of the damage is actually due to the flooding, but it's quite sad. It's very, very sad. That's today's technology, and nobody was killed due to the nuclear accident, but land was lost and people lost their homes. Advanced reactors have as a safety criteria that their worst day does not have impacts off site, so that those impacts on the worst day are on the site and people don't have to evacuate and there is not contamination of land that causes people to lose their homes. And to me, that's really important because I don't think it's ever going to be acceptable that somebody might lose their home because it's the worst possible day. And that's due to the safety features and the new technologies that Robbie described. That's where we get to with advanced technologies.
Great. So we have a couple questions about waste. First, for recycling, how much fuel can we recover from that? There's a few. We got a few questions.
Okay, so then I'll consider myself ready here. Oh, should I wait for the rest?
I'm going to group them all together.
Okay, you're grouping them.
There's a potpourri of questions. So how do we recover fuel from recycling? What are we doing with the current waste sitting at the reactors? And how do we deal with waste from mining?
Okay, so that's 4. I'll see if I get. So with respect to the waste with our current reactors, it's sitting either in basically cooling pools, so on site, or it's in those dry cask storage facilities or casks that are basically holding it. So that's where our waste is currently, and it is basically on the reactor site. So that's kind of that one. The question about how much could we recover? There's a lot of different ways that you could answer that. So we have approximately 90,000 metric tons of used nuclear fuel in the US right now. So that's kind of a hard number to wrap one's head around. It turns out that is, you basically, if you had a football field and stacked it 3 stories high, that's about the amount of material that exists from our nuclear waste, so volume-wise. So what does that mean as far as what we could recover and use with it? I think probably what people are thinking about, does this buy me enough energy to power 1 reactor for a year or hundreds of reactors for a year? And it depends on what type of reactor you deploy. So nominally, this waste was accrued over about 50, almost 60 years of reactor operation in the US. So if you just kind of did a first approximation using current reactor technology or even some advanced reactor technologies, you could say nominally at the current production rate, this would maybe buy us about 60 years worth of electricity. Now you could go through and say, okay, well, what if we expand, our nuclear capacity beyond what we have? Or what if we change the types of reactors that we actually deploy? So some reactors are actually called fast spectrum reactors, and this just means that they have more energetic neutrons and that they can actually use the fuel on some level more efficiently. And so now instead of saying maybe we've got about 60 years worth of fuel at about, kind of our current nuclear energy deployment, maybe you start having a conversation of, do we have on the order of hundreds to, 1,000 years worth of fuel, right? And things get kind of uncertain when you start talking about, up to 1,000 years worth of fuel. But so that, there's a lot of potential energy depending on how you actually deploy your fuel cycle, and then also, your recovery technologies. And then I think the other question in there was, how do you actually go about this? Like, I think kind of the question speaks to, what does this actually look like? So there's currently deployed technologies, and then there's sort of what could be the future. So the currently deployed technologies are basically what we've inherited from the weapons program, candidly. So we developed what was called the PureX process, and we use this to basically make the plutonium for our weapons. This has been the only technology that's been deployed commercially. So we used it for a little bit in the US, actually in the 70s, and then France has used it a lot of it over the course of the time there. And what is interesting about PureX is a couple of different things about why we might be interested in moving away from it. One of them is that it, so basically it makes pure plutonium streams, which we perhaps don't want to do because of the weapons ramifications of that. But then also we're talking about massive, tens of billions of dollars worth of facilities, right? And so courtesy of the conversations we were having earlier about construction, right, this is not something that we do well, is build these big facilities. So we might actually want to look at other technologies, and there are other options on the table. But to, I think, truly speak to the original question, which was, how does this look? Basically, you have your fuel. It's a ceramic, kind of like tile, or not to be too crass, but frankly, your toilet bowl. You would chop that up. You would dissolve it in acid, and then you would actually, once you have it in solution, you could do separations on that. Or there's a couple of different ways that you could imagine it. But so I probably filibustered long enough on the how one would separate, but you could see I could speak for a while on it.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, which is how, let's see, what are the kind of cost targets for advanced reactors, and how are we going to address those through changing how we build reactors?
Yeah, I think as someone who's trying to build one, I should know, right? So I think the cost targets are all over the place, and I would say you're going to get an esoteric answer from me, and I apologize for that. I think as the co-founder of a nuclear energy startup, I should have a more succinct answer, but I just did a PhD on the topic, so you're going to unfortunately get a more long-winded answer than maybe you were looking for. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to think about cost targets, and I would say at Boston Atomics, our specific focus is actually that cost will be the result of your ability to construct it, and that you will gain a lot of cost advantage by being able to build it quickly, and that is where the cost savings is going to come. But how much cost savings that's going to be, I think is very, very difficult to conjecture at this stage. Now, I would say advanced reactors across the board, everyone, we all think that we're going to produce electricity at prices that are going to provide returns for the investors on building their projects, right? So that's, if you think about dollars per watt, so how much dollar per kilowatt of capacity, I think advanced reactors will come between $4,000 to $6,000 per kilowatt, and that's to give you context for that number. The plants being built in Georgia right now that are light water technology are about $12,000. So I think we're going to have a huge cost reduction from advanced nuclear technology. I think we're going to be able to construct them a lot easier, a lot more quickly, and there's going to be a lot of advantages there. The other thing I'll say is that the cost of all electricity is rising. Natural gas prices are rising. That's driving electricity bills up. A little bit here in the U.S., massively in Europe. A project in the UK at $10,000 per kilowatt, which is a very high number just to give you some context, that was maybe questionably economically, is now actually very advantageous for the UK. It's going to provide a lot of very valuable baseload power. So what the future of our electricity grids looks like in a low carbon world is very uncertain, but I am confident that nuclear will play a valuable role in bringing those prices down and providing assets to the grid like reliability, baseload supply, that are going to be economic and pay off on our electricity bills.
Let me just add to that there's a lot of investment going into nuclear startups like Robbie's and those other 50 companies right now, and the investors from the ones I've spoken with, they're entering those investments with the expectation that they've done due diligence, and their expectation is that either they're investing in a small modular reactor, so on the larger size, 100 to 300 megawatts, that's going to be competitive with natural gas and is going to replace a coal plant. You know, there are a lot of coal plants around the country. Many of them are shutting down, maybe 200 gigawatts over the next couple decades. And there's a real drive to put a new generation source, repower that community, but with clean energy. So a lot of small modular nuclear reactors are targeting that to be competitive with natural gas electricity. And then the microreactors in many cases are targeting being competitive with diesel generators. And so there the investors are doing diligence and deciding that those are going to be competitive with diesel generators, so they're going to invest.
Great. Do we have one question over here you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was wondering, you have two big nuclear plant operators, the energy sector and the defense sector. How do you exchange information, knowledge? How do you do as a research center? Do you duplicate or do you work together?
So I would say that there's a decent level of coordination, at least within the federal government, right, with respect to, you know, talking about what the DoD is up to, what the commercial sector is up to, and trying to figure out how to leverage those pieces together. For example, and Ashley could probably talk quite a bit about this, you know, Project Pele is nominally a DoD project, right? But it's perceived as really being able to be a first mover in this space because, you know, frankly, the DoD operates differently than the commercial sector, right? They're not looking at the markets and the balance sheet and kind of all these sorts of things. They can say, okay, what does it take to get this through regulation? We'll pay it. Let's move on, right? And so because of that, that's providing opportunities for the regulators to get familiar with these technologies, right? I think that probably other parts of the DOE are, you know, being very attentive as to what are the lessons that can be learned within this. But so as far as I can tell, there's quite a bit of coordination. So, and you might have more.
Yeah, I'll add just one point, which is people. And a lot of Navy nuclear folks, when they retire, end up in the nuclear industry in some form or another. So they build, you know, a decade or more of experience operating submarines, aircraft, carriers, whatever the nuclear-powered vessel is. And they bring that experience, that network, that knowledge into many of the nuclear companies for commercial power in the U.S.
And actually, I might not be able to help myself. And I see your question, that you're actually starting to see universities speaking about the people supply chain and supply line, right? Universities like the University of Illinois and Penn State moving forward, trying to build advanced reactors on campus, in part to get access to the technology, but also so that they're actually able to effectively train the next generation on the operation of these facilities. So, but I don't want to, oh no, all right, you.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just wondering if you guys could speak to something that I think is really important to Nantucket, is how would you compare or look at like offshore wind compared to like nuclear? Like how is it more efficient? How is it more cost effective? How is it cleaner? Can you guys speak to that at all?
I will just take a quote from Ashley earlier, which is, it's about shots on goal and decarbonization. And so Nantucket, the Cape, Massachusetts in general, I think offshore wind is a great opportunity and something we need to run for because of the decarbonization power it provides. But it's not going to get us from the 5% wind we are today to 100% decarbonized grid. And so that's why I say it's a shots on goal game. It's a yes and. It's a yes, we need this offshore wind, and yes and we need nuclear power, and yes and we need more solar deployments if we're going to decarbonize our electricity grid. So it's an all of the above sort of answer.
Yeah, and maybe I'll be the farthest removed from this community. I definitely agree with everything. I think one of the things when we look at climate change and what needs to happen, not only do we need to transition our electrical grid, but also our industries, right? So there are many industries that are tough to decarbonize, and oh, by the way, now we're trying to electrify them. We're trying to electrify transportation. And so that's really, we need as many electrons on the grid as possible. And, kind of when you're looking at the crude nuts and bolts about, what does wind give us versus nuclear, I mean, really, it's kind of this, it is kind of a straightforward comparison in that what nuclear, they're both low carbon. What nuclear provides is firm baseload electricity. Wind has intermittency. And so basically what you need is the opportunity to ballast that intermittent nature. And now you can do it a lot of different ways. You can do it potentially with other storage technologies. Nominally, how we're ballasting renewables right now is frankly with natural gas, right? And so so that's really kind of what it is. But I'm definitely a champion or an advocate for all of the above because we need to get as many electrons on the grid deployed as possible, and the supply chain and grid impacts of trying to do this are going to be non-trivial. So.
Yeah, now you've got me going. Sorry. The other thing I'll say is, and this is a point I tried to make earlier. It's three nuclear reactors in New England provide 25%. So these are two individual sites, because one of them has 2 reactors, providing 25% of all of New England's electricity. So the land use of nuclear is just tiny compared to solar and wind. So when you think about where you're going to see wind, you're going to see a lot of turbines to provide the equivalent of power that you would get from just even one additional nuclear power plant. Well, we'll say thank you all for coming.
River's in charge.
Yeah, I think he's pointing to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask about mining uranium. And is there radioactive tailings that are produced, and how can the industry mitigate that as far as mining uranium?
Yes.
With toxic side effects, can they mitigate that?
Yes, thank you very much. And sorry, that was asked by River, and I didn't cover it. So actually, we can be more effective in how we manage our mines, and classically we haven't done that very well. So basically in sequestering them, because when you pull the uranium out, what you leave behind are radioactive daughter products, and they concentrate, and even though they were always there, they are now kind of concentrated because the uranium was kind of diluting them, and you've done some things to it. So this is something to be attentive to, but I'll also say, and this isn't to try and take a pot shot at renewables, but many clean energy technologies rely on rare earths, and they also are co-located with things like thorium and uranium. So when you actually go to recover rare earths, you actually run into the identical challenge of, now I've left behind a radioactive material site. And so actually we're getting ready to look at phytoremediation and some, basically other ways that we can manage this more effectively. But this is also one of the reasons why I'm a big advocate for reprocessing, candidly, is because you've already done the dirty work in the mining, for better or worse. And so now you aren't looking at needing to dig more material up out of the ground. You might as well try and capitalize on it as much as possible. And so hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Taking it from the global to the local, how long would it take to get a micro reactor generating power to be on Nantucket?
You're building them, but Nantucket's roughly peaking around 50 megawatts, roughly. So when are you going to be ready?
So I'm going a little bigger. Our target's 200 megawatts. So you need a coalition of Nantuckets to buy power.
Carriers generate power for 6,000. I can't get 3 of those.
Just a dock here at
Get the reactors.
Yeah, just get the 15 micro reactors to.
I think microreactors. So again, this is outside of. We're working on a small modular reactor, sort of the next size up, a little bit longer development timeline, more engineering work, more site permitting in our case. But in the case of a microreactor, I think most of them are looking for large-scale deployment by the end of the decade. And so before 2030, they would hope to have a commercial product that they've tested at a site helped by NRIC, and that they're hoping to offer globally.
And there are also startup companies looking at, you mentioned parking aircraft carriers. Well, Russia parks an icebreaker and powers some northern cities in Russia with a nuclear icebreaker ship. But there are also some startup models of companies looking at marine-based nuclear, so either on a ship or even just on an oil platform. So that's also an option, and River's our expert on marine nuclear, by the way. So.
Yeah, I'll just add, I am part of a group working with NRIC that was awarded a grant by Department of Energy to explore these things. So we're, again, in the spirit of NRIC, not necessarily at could this be done, but more how do you demonstrate it, right? Is there a safe space somewhere owned by Department of Energy or the Coast Guard or something where we could actually demonstrate one of these things? And our partners are all from the maritime sector. We work with the American Bureau of Shipping, and they get more and more calls every day from industry about how can we use this. So there's a lot of really exciting opportunities there, but a lot of interesting questions as well to address.
Why are the nuclear reactors shut down? I mean, this is a striking number, 24% of the electricity today is provided by nuclear. That's after Massachusetts has shut down several. Why is that?
I'll take a nickel tour on this. So nominally, one of the things that, cheap natural gas has done no favors, I think, with respect to nuclear. And so when that was a time, right, that really, I think, impacted nuclear's bottom line as far as that's concerned. So that's basically one reason. But then also at the same time of it, what's actually, many of the nuclear reactor facilities, they're paid off, right? They were built in the 70s, or they've been refined. But I mean, that's not what's driving their costs. What's driving their cost right now is their operational costs. So the cost of people, maintenance, kind of all these sorts of things. And so, and it turns out that that's not cheap. And that's actually something that they're trying to look at very seriously when it comes to advanced reactors, is how do we actually decrease not only the capital costs in the site, but how do we actually digitize things, decrease the number of people that we need in a safe way with respect to these technologies. So I think kind of the nickel tour was, for a while, it was cheap natural gas, but then I think there were also probably some other compounding factors with respect to kind of the mandate to also buy renewables. And this depends on your market sector, but buy those preferentially off the grid. And so, but there might be other things on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the things Jenifer said that nails a point is to digitize them, right? These plants were designed in the 1970s, so they're analog. There's not what we think about technology today. There's no iPhones, iPads. There's no the personal computer. The way that it's used today is not how these plants were designed. So the reason operating costs are so expensive is because you're operating something designed 50 years ago, and that's just that's not how we build new things today, and that's how we get operating costs down. And then the second thing is, I think, political pressure, social pressure, community pressure can have a lot to shut down plants. I think that was a factor at the Plymouth plant, but I think that the tide is turning there. So Diablo Canyon, which is a plant in California, has for a long time sort of been planned to shut down in the next couple of years. But the governor of California has now said that maybe we should reconsider that from the decarbonization standpoint, we need to keep this nuclear plant operating. And for the first time in this plant's history, the majority of Californians, gotta love them, want to keep the plant open, which is I think the tide is really turning for nuclear here. No offense to any Californians here. My sister lives there.
Yeah. How does the U.S. government, do they help incentivize you guys? Do they give you tax credits and like they do in the intermittent products?
Yeah, so from the development standpoint, this is exactly what Ashley's job is to help companies like mine, whether that's engineering expertise we need, test experimental infrastructures, and financial support. So specifically right now, we're supported. Yeah, it is grant-based. We apply for the grant. You apply for the grant. There's also, I think, in the new. There's a new loan officer inside the DOE who wants to provide loan guarantees for low carbon projects, and that's another aspect for when you actually go to build the energy infrastructure, which lowers the interest rate and financing costs of the project.
And there's now a civil nuclear credit program that was just passed and put into place. It's like credits, but It's only going right now towards plants that had previously announced they were shutting down. So the answer is that the government is trying to do things. There are some states, New York and Illinois, did some tax credit work, zero emissions credits, ZECs they call them, to try to keep open some plants that were going to shut down. But is there a tax credit similar to what oil and gas and renewables get across the board? No, there's not right now. But there are some mechanisms.
The last question over here, and then we're going to say thank you.
There's currently 5 or 6 units that are decommissioned in New England. Why can't, even though you mentioned the analog, why can't these sites still be used for the new technology that you're suggesting? I mean, you still can use the containment buildings, you still can use the turbine buildings, the cooling intake, outtake. Can't that all be reused with the new technology you're trying to introduce?
So I'll take a crack at that. Some of it can be reused. The highest value items at those sites would be the transmission and some of the other, the site's been developed. There are parking lots and roads and security and things. Most of the things like the containment and those buildings, probably not, because the standards are just very high and they haven't been maintained. But the transmission's very valuable. And so that's part of the reason a lot of companies are looking at coal plant sites that have transmission and also have a workforce. And they're supportive of their generation there, they're supportive of their coal plant, and they're looking for something to replace that. So that's being looked at. Existing nuclear sites are being looked at. Holtec in New Jersey has the decommissioning project. I think it's Oyster Creek, and they're looking at Oyster Creek in New Jersey as maybe a site for an advanced reactor down the road. So we are seeing that a little bit, and maybe more in the future. The politics will play into it as well, relative to New England in particular, where it's not as supportive as other parts of the country.